All right. Hello, my name is Alvaro, and this is my presentation on the biomechanics of fish fins and their future in bioengineering. With 71% of Earth's surface covered in water, the oceans have provided one of the largest collections of life and evolving ecosystems on Earth, providing the right conditions that probably resulted in the first complex organisms on our planet, and would kickstart evolutionary tree and this process that would eventually lead to us sitting here. However, looking at this evolutionary tree, I think it's safe to say that fish, as a general sort of organism, are one of the oldest life forms on our planet. And thus, they've had the most time to develop and evolve these efficient and complex systems to give them the best advantage in their environments. As you can see, they've probably had around 500 million years to evolve probably the most complex and refined mechanisms to interact with water out of any other life form. And a large element of this sort of adaptation to water, and one that is essential to the fish morphology or the fish sort of physical structure, is their fins. And not only sort of from a visual aspect, but more so from a biomechanical aspect, what do these fins do not only for the locomotion or the movement of the individual fish, but then how can we apply these concepts for our future in locomotion and transportation in engineering? So in this presentation, I'm going to break down fish fins. I'm going to go over the structure, why they're important, and really what's the use of studying this. And then I'm going to look at this one paper about a robo-fin. I'm a big fan of the term robo-fin. It always made me laugh. I thought it was very similar to sort of like RoboCop. I feel like it could show up in that movie, but I'm gonna go over the methodology, the results, and the inclusion of that paper. And then I'm gonna bring a overall take-home message for the whole presentation. All right, so let's look at fish structure. Fish fins can be broken down into two primary types. The pair fins, which pretty self-explanatory. They're like arms and legs. They're symmetrical on both sides. There's pairs of them. And usually they include the pectoral fin, the pelvic fin, and the anal fin. The other type of fins are medium fins, which run down the middle axis of the fish, so pretty much the head to the tail. And they're by themselves. They're not a couple of fins. These usually include the dorsal fin and the caudal fin, or the tail fin. Each of these fins has a really unique role that contribute to a fish's ability to quickly propel, change directions, balance while swimming, so their overall movement underwater. If you're in Bio 215 right now in animal behavior, or you've ever had a pet fish, I'm sure you know these quick bursts of movement. Whenever they're scared or surprised at something, you will see the fish dart around really quick. And that whole sequence of locomotion is based entirely on these movements from their fins. So on a closer look, the structure of the fin is actually composed of several thin and segmented bony rays. And these are called hymenotrics. Usually with a diameter about 500 micrometers. They're very, very small, very, very thin. And each of these are connected by sort of this collagen fiber, and then that's covered in skin. But I guess in essence, the really key part about this, their structure, is that there are no muscles inside of the fin. So unlike our fingers or our arms, where it's bone covered in muscles, the actual fins of fish don't have muscles in them. Instead, they control them through base muscles at their peduncle, is what is called at the base of the fish. And these muscles are just provide basic push-pull forces, each muscle controlling a separate ray. But it's through the structure that rays are both insanely complex in their movement. They're both very bendy and very fluid. And still under the high forces while they're swimming, they don't collapse. They're very strong still. So what makes fish fins so cool? It's often said that nature is a better innovator than humans. Fish fins, like I just said, represent some of the most efficient and effective models of movement or propulsion underwater. They've had millions of years to evolve and refine these mechanisms in live or die environments and this sort of natural selection. When we look at traditional methods that we have to move underwater, we tend to see propellers or jets or stuff like that. And it's been the same technology for almost 100 years, more or less, the same sort of basic principles. But we don't really see any of this type of movement in the wild. It's very noisy and it's very inefficient compared to what nature has developed. And actually, a deep dive into this investigation of the propulsion methods of fish and then how we can use them in our current technology is the paper we're going to be looking at, which is the investigation of fish caudal locomotion using a bio-inspired robotic model. So this is a paper from a university in Beijing, China. And the paper pretty much noticed that historically, robotic models of fish fins severely lacked the fluidity that I was just explaining, sort of the bendiness and sort of the whole movement. They've really lacked that in their robotic models. Instead, they tended to just be a very rigid piece that would go left and right. And this is representative of the actual biomechanics of a fin. While the fish is moving, their tail fin, the caudal fin, which is what we're going to be looking at today, actually moves in all sorts of axes. It moves up, down, left, right. It moves by its angle. And this paper set out to create sort of this experimental platform to investigate the propulsion and then the hydrodynamic effect of this fin. To do this, they designed a robotic tail fin completely based off of the morphology of a bluegill sunfish, which we can see to the left. In essence, they created a robo-fin and ran it in a tank of water, to put it simply. As you can see on the image to the right, we see sort of this robotic, the robotic model of the fin. We can see that they used the ray structures covered by this sort of collagen material, and they also copied the shape. Each of these rays are then attached to their own motor, which would replicate the push-pull muscles in an actual fish. So they put this fish into a tank of water. It's about 8 meters in length, about 1.5 meters in width, and about 1 meter tall. The fin is then attached to a metal rod. This rod is going to control the pitch. So basically the angle that the fin moves at. This rod is then attached to a metal plate, which controls the heave or the side-to-side up-down motion. So the motion on the x-axis and y-axis. Then this plate is attached to a 4,000 watt alternating current motor, which is a bit overkill, I think. But pretty much this motor then controls the toe of the robotic fin. So it's going to replicate sort of a fin moving forward through water. So what are we looking for in the results of this experiment? Well, really, you can break it down in 3 parts. The Robo-fin shows us a certain basic kinematic of how a fish fin works. Then it provides us insight on the hydrodynamic forces. And then ultimately it also shows us sort of the wake, so pretty much the displacement of the water around it and what it creates, what effects it has. Before the researchers could measure sort of the forces and the wake and all that of the Robo-fin, they had to make sure the movement of the robotic fin were true to the real thing. They had to replicate the movement of real tail fin. This movement is known as the undulation pattern. So pretty much the waviness of the fin. As you can see in the diagram, sort of the yellow curve is the trailing edge of the fin. So sort of that outline that the fin makes. And the red arrows are the individual ray movements. So pretty much in what direction each sort of ray is moving at to create this sort of wave. If we were to map this out on just the Robo-fin just going straight through water, this is what it looked like, which isn't very accurate to the real movement of a fish. It creates a sort of messy pattern. With a true undulation pattern, we get this sort of effect where they have this sort of like center point that they always intersect to, no matter their movement. So pretty much how do they get to mapping this? There's a bit of math here. I'm not going to go too in depth in it, but what's important are pretty much the variables. Y subscript U is the horizontal displacement. A is going to be the amplitude of the fin ray. So pretty much how the amplitude of the actual movements of the ray. F, of course, is going to be the motion frequency. So how many sort of flaps, I guess you can say, within a certain time. Lambda is going to be the undulation wavelength. And phi, which this is very key to the results of the experiment, is the phase angle or the pitch. So pretty much that metal rod, how far is it going to be rotating the actual tail? So that's it for kinematics. And now we can jump straight into the hydrodynamic forces. Really the forces in this experiment are cut into two primary parts, lift and thrust. I think it's a lot more easy to visualize these through a plane. Lift is going to be the force that sort of literally lifts up the plane. Thrust would be the force coming from the engine, from the jets, pushing the whatever object, the plane, forward. Or in our case, it's going to be the thrust generated from the actual fin, the propulsion generated from that. And then another key aspect of this, of course, is drag, which is the resulting sort of resistance that we have when we try to move through any sort of fluid or gas, right? Sort of wind resistance, water resistance. I'm sure you guys all know when you're swimming, it's not like you're swimming through air. You have resistance when you're swimming. And this is going to be very key to our results. So going back to our experiments, pretty much what they did is they tested at different towing speeds. So different speeds moving the fin forward from 0 centimeters per second to 5 to 10. And they did this for both a no motion, which would be the fin without a undulation pattern, and undulation, which would be the fin with the, true to real life, true to the real biology of the fish pattern that we saw before. As we can see in overall, through the graph, mean thrust decreased as towing speeds increased. However, this is more of a result of the drag. At faster speeds, sort of the thrust gets completely negated by the drag created. And of course, we can see this from both in no fin motion and undulation when through the green bar, where when the speed is 10 centimeters per second, the drag is completely overcoming the force produced. However, the really key part of this is the difference within 5 centimeters per second, which can be seen through the yellow bar. For no fin motions, it's practically zero. And in undulation, so with the pattern, there's actually a 17% increase. So a pretty significant difference when the Robo-fin is moving at a true to life way. It's creating a significantly more amount of thrust. So this thrust was at this speed was then held constant, and they ran the same experiments, but at this time changing the phase angle, so the degrees of pitch, and they run it from 0 to 315 degrees. And at this point, you can see at 0 degrees, the tail is at its, or the fin is at its maximum thrust. Then it goes down at 135 degrees, only to reach its maximum again at 315. So the results were really similar with lift. On the left, we can see the same sort of a bar chart where overall, the faster the tail fin goes, the less force we have created, but this is because of drag. However, in lift, the difference with between the no fin motion and the undulating motion were really, really significant. It was a 400% difference at 5 centimeters per second. So really significant change. Now, a really key part of this results section, especially for the hydrodynamic forces, is that when we're looking at both the thrust and the lift at different sort of pitch angles, right, we can see that none of them are ever at both a minimum or a maximum at the same time. They're sort of overlapping each other. Where one's at its minimum, the other one is at its maximum. This is a really interesting part of the results that they found. I guess just to sort of really dig this point into the grave, then they sort of mapped out thrust and lift again with the added heave motion, and then at just 2 specific phase angles, so 90 degrees and 225. So the fin would move 90 degrees in one way, 90 degrees in the other. And same thing for 225, 225. I brought up my great drawing of our sort of the model, just to remind you guys of the pitch motion and the heave motion. But through this, we can see that thrust is significantly, both thrust and lift are significantly improved or grow, I guess you can say, at different phase angles or different pitch angles. So that's for hydrodynamic forces. And now we can move on to probably my favorite part of this whole research paper and what really hooked me into it, and that's the wake. So the way that they measured the wake left behind from the Robo-fin was through this process called a digital particle image velocimetry, or DPIV. Pretty much they set these cameras overlooking the sort of array of lasers. Then when movement would occur, as we can see in the image on the right is for a bird, but you get the idea. When sort of displacement occurs, that particle array from the laser changes. So I guess you can imagine it sort of the topology of a map. You know how you have the maps of like a mountain range. The closer they are together, the sort of the more steep the cliff is. When they're more further apart, the more sort of plain it is. More or less, it's the same idea for this, where they can look at the displacements of this particle pattern and then infer different sort of the movements of the water around it. So for our experiments, they actually set up different lasers and different cameras at multiple different axes. They'd grab then the individual data of these, and they put it together to create an overall vorticity model, which would be sort of imagining it in a 3D sense. But first, we can take a look at one of the sort of single two-dimensional particle array results, I guess you could say. So on this key part is that blue is pretty much the flow of the water going backwards. So pretty much as the tail moves forward, the flow of the water goes backwards like that. And red is the flow going forward. So in essence, being sucked back in. And the sort of darkness of these colors, I guess you could say, signify the magnitude of these forces. So the sort of wake flows between the no motion and for the undulating pattern tail were significantly different. For a no fin motion, the tail fin sort of pushed the flow downstream, which we can see through figure A. And at a pretty high speed, a pretty significant magnitude. In contrast, the magnitude of the wake flow speed for the undulating pattern was relatively small. And instead of pushing the water downwards, it sort of sucked it in. And this is looking from the y-axis, so from top down of the tail. The results were also very similar for the z-axis and for the x-axis, where in essence, the no-fin motion was this really messy, sort of inefficient displacement of water, and the undulating motion was a more concentrated, more powerful sort of motion. And through this 3D model of the vortex, then they grabbed all these different axes, two-dimensional axes, and they put it together to map out these models. On the left, we can see the non-undulating pattern, so this would be the no fin motion. And on the right is the fin motion. And what's key here is to pay attention to this yellow line, which is the horizontal plane. So sort of pretty much the straight x-axis of the tank. For the no fin motion, the vortex magnitude was significantly larger, as you can see by the darker colors. And the overall direction of this vortex is pretty much parallel to the horizontal plane. So it's sort of a straight push out, also equal on both sides. For the undulating pattern, however, the sort of vortex magnitude seemed a little smaller. As we can see, the sort of the colors are a bit lighter than from the left. And there, however, and this is the key part, the overall heading direction, which we can see by looking at sort of the pattern of the colors following this like mid-line, the mid like yellow line, the vortex deviated from the horizontal axis. If we pay attention to sort of the vectors for both, we can find that the no fin motion, the velocity magnitudes on both sides of the plane were generally equal, which means the water, after the tail moves through, the water is jetted out on both sides at pretty much equal velocities. However, then for the undulating pattern, the water jet was mainly formed on one side, which means that instead of pushing water down and straight down the path of the tail, it's actually pushed out to the side. So I guess pretty much what are the overall results of this lab? Why of this research paper? Why are they important? Well, the fact that the thrust force of the undulating fin is not along the body axis, but instead at a certain angle relative to the body, it jets out away from the body. no other research had taken this sort of vortex hydrodynamic effect of the undulating pattern, of like a true undulating pattern. And the paper actually then referenced existing research on shark tails that also have this similar asymmetrical thrust force. And they found that it's probably essential to balancing the body of the fish and sort of maneuverability at higher speeds. As I said before, no other research really considered the heave and the pitch in the tail fin. So it was really breakthrough to sort of really set down a model to mimic this motion and to actually look at the effects of it. However, the real sort of crux, the big takeaway from this paper is the fact that both the flow speed, so the speed of the fish, and then the phase shift, so sort of the rotational pitch axis, right? Fine-tuning these resulted in huge thrust and lift force improvements, which shows that the muscles of a fish are intrinsically controlling the tail fin, and they've evolved such a sophisticated mechanism to produce this complex like 3D motion and to make this complex sort of asymmetrical thrust. And it's all been a developmental process for this really, really effective mode of propulsion. So what? Well, with the turn of the century and the push to make sort of technology more and more natural, really a growing field has been that of bioengineering. And this is the combination or even inspiration of engineering through principles of design and analysis found in biological systems. This study of fish fins to enhance our understanding of propulsion and locomotion in water is a great example of this emerging field. From an engineering perspective, fish fins really show that they have that fish fins are truly sort of a sort of synergy of a lot of different components to create this almost perfect, efficient, and really effective mode of propulsion. And studying this can really provide true breakthroughs to how we move underwater. In essence, the possibilities are really endless, but not as endless as our deep blue sea. Thank you.